So a huge welcome to everyone who's joined us today. We've got a really exciting panel to go through over the next hour and a half. So we're going to run through panel inputs, which will average about 15 minutes per panelist, and then we'll go on to Q&A. So first, a little bit about myself. My name is Roberta Capieri. I'm from Cork, Ireland. I'm an aid worker turned economist student. And so our panelists today are, in order of appearance, Oliver Bullough, who's a journalist and author of Moneyland. Michael McCarthy Flynn, the Senior Research and Policy Coordinator with Oxfam. Kadia Sharif, Senior Editor of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and Max Haywood, Head of Policy at Transparency International. We have Oliver Haney on tech supporting the session, so if you have any tech issues, you can send him a direct message and he should be able to sort it out. Common questions: we are recording today's session and it will be put up on our website in the week or so after the session is finished. We're also screening this live on Facebook in case that you have an issue with the Zoom. You should be able to view it on Facebook as well. So I think that's the majority of the housekeeping. We also just have a Q&A session. So if you look at your Zoom at the bottom bar, you have two different options. You have Q&A and you have chat. So we'll use the chat as a chat function. Introduce yourself, where you're from. You can discuss what's going on in the session. If you want to ask questions, use the Q&A function. We should have the upvote function as well. So we may not be able to get to everyone's questions, but you can vote as well for questions that you want to be answered. And that will help us filter and make sure that the most important questions do get answered. So feel free to use those. So we have 100 participants online, which is a great turnout. I'm sure more will come as well as the meeting goes on, as the panel goes on. So that's it for housekeeping. Tax and inequality. So today we're going to focus specifically on shell companies. So I think a lot of you will be familiar with the concept of what a shell company is from the Panama Papers link of 2016, which is a good number of years ago now. Where has all that gone? What was the fallout from that massive leak? And for those of you who maybe weren't following that leak, what is a shell company? Well, a shell company is a company that holds assets, financial assets, or intellectual property, but doesn't necessarily have an offices or staff or anything like that. So not the traditional company. And it can be used to hide assets in certain circumstances, and in certain circumstances, it can be used to hide assets for tax evasion, tax avoidance, and money laundering and other kind of illicit activities. It can be viewed as quite a side issue. So why should we as economists or economics students care about it? Gabriel Zucman's done a huge amount of work on this subject, and he recently released a paper that estimated globally how much money is being channeled into offshore mechanisms, including shell companies, and that paper estimated that it's 10% of GDP globally that is hidden offshore. Now that's not equally spread through each country. So he estimates that up to 60% of the wealth in Russia, the Gulf countries, and Latin America are held offshore, therefore perhaps out of the reach of the tax network as well. So shell companies, they tend to be things that multinationals or rich individuals use. Why should we care what they're up to? Well, these things always have an impact, and they impact most on the poorest. And today we're going to really look deeply into how we connect what's going on with the wealthiest in the world to what's going on with the poorest people in the world. So we've got a great panel to discuss that today. So I'm going to hand over now to our first panelist. So as I mentioned, it's Oliver Bullough. He's an award-winning author and journalist. His book Moneyland combines his in-depth research as a journalist with a rich narrative style that fills out the story of how wealth hides in plain sight. So perhaps first off, Oliver, if you can tell us what we mean more in depth about the phrase shell company and place that within the framework which you call Moneyland in your book.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm not quite sure the backgrounds of everyone on the call, so what I thought I'd do was talk about how I first came across shell companies, which I think also serves as a kind of quite a useful explanation of what they are and what they're for. I write mainly about kleptocracy rather than tax dodging, tax evasion, or tax avoidance, but I think the relevance of what I'm talking about is clear to both subjects. So I used to live in the former Soviet Union, and I came across corruption, obviously on a, if not a daily basis, then a weekly basis, whether that was, being shaken down myself for bribes or having friends shaken down or hearing stories about people being shaken down. It was obviously just an ordinary part of life. And that's pretty much what I thought corruption was. Corruption was just a sort of an irritation in which, venal officials made your life difficult in order to extract a bit of money out of you. And that is pretty much what the Transparency International definition of corruption is: the misuse of public office for private gain, extorting bribes from ordinary people in order to make yourself richer. But it was when I was in Ukraine in 2014, where they had massive street protests against the government, mainly, or not entirely, but largely driven by anger over corruption, that I gained a sort of a better and a deeper understanding of what corruption was, and about the role of shell companies in making that corruption work, in facilitating that corruption. And it was, after the president fled in 2014, he's left behind his various palaces and various other luxurious places that he used to hang out. And it was quite fun to poke around and see them. He had really appalling taste. He liked to invest heavily in sort of gold chandeliers and massive flat screen televisions, huge quantities of overstuffed furniture and so on. And it was quite fun to bounce up and down on his bed, safe in the knowledge that this was a man who previously had been so powerful that he could have had protesters shot and now was, hiding in exile in Russia, and people like me were able to explore his bedroom. It was quite entertaining. And I remember one time I'd been looking around his hunting lodge. He had a big palace outside Kiev and also a not as luxurious, but still pretty good hunting lodge in a forest a bit further outside the capital. And I remarked, quite casually to Anton, who was an activist who was showing me around, that I was surprised that the Ukrainians had allowed him to get away, with so much. He'd stolen so much money that he'd built himself these astonishingly luxurious palaces, really either in the capital or very close to the capital. How was it that the Ukrainians had not risen up before, considering how much he was stealing from them? And Anton, remarked surprisingly coolly, considering that it was a bit of a patronizing question, that they hadn't known that this hunting lodge had belonged to the president. They'd suspected it had, but they hadn't really known. And he pointed out that, in fact, legally speaking, the hunting lodge and all the land on which it was built were actually in England. I didn't really know what he was talking about, but I went back to my flat that evening and I looked up the ownership documents for the hunting lodge. And sure enough, the Ukrainian company that owned it, was owned by a British company. The company was called Astute Partners Limited and was registered in central London at an address on Harley Street. That company in turn was owned by another British company, Blythe Europe Limited, which was in turn owned by a foundation in Liechtenstein. And though the two British companies declared who owned them, if you looked up the documents, the foundation in Liechtenstein did not. So what this chain of three structures did for the president was essentially hide his ownership, hide the fact that he had stolen this land and stolen the money with which he could build a hunting lodge. And instead it looked like it belonged to a totally innocent foreign investor, like many other places in Ukraine that had been built, for tourism purposes or whatever. And this was essentially the first shell company I'd come across, and I was absolutely amazed. I suppose I was amazed particularly because it totally upended the traditional understanding of what corruption is. We think of corruption in Ukraine as a Ukrainian problem. Yet here was the president of Ukraine making use of a structure in the UK and another one in Liechtenstein, both of them supposedly clean, non-corrupt jurisdictions, to hide his wealth. And when I started talking to people about, this amazing revelation I'd made, they looked at me like I was a complete moron, because this wasn't a revelation at all. This is quite obviously how corrupt officials have been hiding their wealth for decades. And the more I looked into the way corruption worked in Ukraine, the more I realized that shell companies were absolutely central to it, whether it was the big market selling knockoff designer goods that were owned in shell companies in Cyprus, or the coal mines, the illegal coal mines that were owned by shell companies in the Caribbean, or ownership of giant gas companies that were owned by shell companies in Hungary or Romania or Austria. Shell companies were absolutely central to the way that the Ukrainian elite had hidden its ownership of a huge proportion of the economy. Ukraine is an amazingly unequal society. The ruling elite has stolen almost everything that isn't nailed down, and quite a lot of things that are nailed down. And they've essentially hidden the fact that they've done that behind these companies. Now, these companies, not as a rule, Ukrainian companies. They are foreign companies. They tend to be registered in places where it's easy to create a company, where a company doesn't look inherently suspicious, places like the UK. So that was my first encounter with a shell company. And I suppose what sort of shocked me about them is that this isn't what companies are supposed to be used for. A company, companies have existed for 500 or 600 years, but companies have really got going in the 19th century, first in the United States and then in Europe, as essentially a way of encouraging entrepreneurial activity. If you were starting a business on your own account and the business went bust, you would be liable to pay all the debts of the business, because those debts of that business would also be your debts. And this is a major disincentive for why someone might want to get started in a business activity. If it's a bit risky, they might think, well, I'd like to do that. I'd like to see if I can make money selling, I don't know, cars or horses or whatever. But if it goes bust, I don't want to be cleaned out. I don't want to lose my house and be left out on the street and have my children starve. So what companies do for you is they allow you to own the company, own a business via a company rather than in your own name. So if the business goes bust, you only lose the money you've put into the company rather than all the other money. It's a form of insurance, essentially. And it was the invention of companies that really turbocharged industrial capitalism in the 19th century, and then in the last century and on to now, because it allows people to invest secure in the knowledge that they're not going to lose everything. So if their company does go bust, if they're not paying the debts, who is paying the debts? Well, society as a whole is. Society is essentially offering insurance to entrepreneurs to allow them to engage in entrepreneurial activity, because if they do, it makes all of us rich. It's good for everyone if we all get rich. So we give everyone insurance, and that's the way it works. Now, what shell companies have done is they've essentially turned that calculation on its head, because if you own a company anonymously, whether by hiding its ownership in a Liechtenstein foundation or in a shell company in places like Nevis, where you don't have to declare who owns the company, then what you've essentially got is an anonymous insurance policy. And that is an absolutely crazy concept, if you think about it. If you could insure your house or insure anything anonymously, it is not just an insurance policy that doesn't make any sense, but it's an active invitation for fraud. I could insure your house, then I could burn it down, and having done so, I could collect on the insurance policy. That's essentially what a shell company is. And the really interesting thing about them is that they can be anywhere. One of the interesting things about the way globalization has worked, and this is incredibly frustrating to law enforcement agencies, is that shell companies can be in any jurisdiction at all. They can essentially insert the rules of one place into the space of another by hiding property in a shell company. If you own property in central London via a company registered in the British Virgin Islands or Jersey or wherever, then essentially the rules of Jersey or the British Virgin Islands govern the ownership declaration of that property rather than the rules of the UK. So that being so, there is a sort of market in increasingly opaque shell companies, because the more opaque a shell company is, the more attractive it is to people who want to hide their identity. And this has led, until relatively recently, it led to jurisdictions competing to sell ever murkier and less regulated shell companies. This is a game that began with various British offshore territories in the 1960s, places like the Cayman Islands, and then later the British Virgin Islands. But then other places got in on the game, places like obviously newly independent British countries like St. Kitts and Nevis, and then American states, places like Delaware Florida, Wyoming, Nevada, and so on. And then it's spread essentially all over the world, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, places. I mean, you can buy a shell company anywhere, and they all do the same job. They will hide your ownership of assets for you. And you know, the interesting thing about them in a way, and what was to me so interesting about the Panama Papers, is that they're not just used by kleptocrats, by people like the president of Ukraine. The same thing that makes them attractive to kleptocrats, the fact that they are easy to set up, that they look respectable, that they are very effective at hiding your ownership of property, those same factors also make them extremely useful to corporations. If you look at where large corporations book their profits, whether that's Apple with its booking its profits in Ireland, or Starbucks booking its profits in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, or Vodafone booking its profits in Luxembourg, or whatever, all of these companies are essentially using shell companies in exactly the same way that a kleptocrat like Yanukovych or another autocrat or dictator uses them to hide their stolen assets. You know, the evil money and the naughty money behaves in exactly the same way, which I think is probably why it's proved so difficult to do anything about them. You know, it is obviously in everyone's interests that kleptocrats are not stealing money, but it is sadly not in everyone's interests that large corporations stop avoiding taxes, because clearly large corporations quite enjoy that. And they will remain to lobby quite hard for shell companies to remain in place so they can continue to make use of their tax minimization strategies. That being so, in the last 10 years or so, there has been a concerted effort, particularly in the large OECD countries, to try and crack down on the more egregious form of shell companies. Britain now has a fully transparent register of company ownership. It's not very good in that you don't actually have the information. It doesn't have to be verified. You have to say who owns a company, but you don't actually have to, that information is verified, so you can write Mickey Mouse down if you like, but it still exists, which is better than they used to be. All EU countries now have to go along with similar measures, have to declare who owns companies. That hasn't happened everywhere yet, but it's supposed to. Even in the United States, which is notorious for the murkiness of its shell companies, particularly in places like Nevada and Wyoming, even in the United States, there is currently an amendment going through Congress, which hopefully will crack open its register of shell companies. So, the world is improving in this regard, but it still remains astonishingly easy to take advantage of companies and essentially use the laws of one jurisdiction to interfere in another one, to use the laws of the UK or Liechtenstein to interfere in Ukraine, or the laws of Dubai to interfere in East Africa or whatever. And the reason that this is relevant to a discussion about inequality, which we're talking about today, is that obviously not everyone can afford to make use of these tricks. An ordinary person on the street can't afford to pay the lawyer's fees and the regulatory filing fees and so on that are required to keep a shell company on the road. These tricks are only available to people who are rich enough to use them. So what you end up with is what I call moneyland in my book of the same name, available in all good bookshops. What you end up with is a system of tax avoidance or regulation avoidance, law avoidance, which is available to people rich enough to make use of it, who are able to exploit the system at the expense of everyone else. So you end up with a system that naturally makes the rich richer and makes the rich and powerful more rich and powerful, while the rest of us end up having to pay for their increasing wealth. And that's why they're so troubling. It is a system that exists exclusively to benefit the rich and powerful at the cost of the rest of us. And this is why it's so important to do something about, and also, sadly, why it's so difficult to do something about. I think you're on mute. Are you on mute, Rebecca?
Yeah, you're muted.
Haha, here we go. Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. That was fantastic. You've painted a really vivid picture of the global situation and how these shell companies have kind of come into being, and what they were kind of initially for and what they've transformed into through the efforts of powerful money lobbying, and what you touch on in your book about the kind of the patchwork of different laws that is ever evolving that people are able to exploit. Following on from that, we're going to talk to Michael McCarthy Flynn from Oxfam. Oxfam work in the poorest countries in the world, in some of the most poor and hard to reach areas within those poor countries. Perhaps you can go into the impact of shell companies and tax avoidance, the impact that those things have had on economies in the global south generally, and the extreme poor within those countries, and then maybe talk a little bit about increases in global inequality.
Yes, thanks, Roberta. And it's great to be here to talk about this. And usually I preface my remarks by apologizing that there's going to be a lot of statistics in what I have to say, but judging by the audience here, I'm not going to apologize this time. I'd also like to thank you for asking that question, because usually when Oxfam is, and me personally from in-laws who work in financial services, or even last week I was on national radio in Ireland 15 minutes after the Apple judgment, there's a bit of confusion going, well, why is Oxfam interested in this? There's still a general ignorance, I think, about the links between what happens here and what happens in developing countries. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about it. In countries like Ireland, almost being able to get a disproportionate amount of tax revenue is seen a badge of honor, like we're taking money from Germany or America and getting a once over on them. But when you start talking about the impact in developing countries, obfuscation starts, and people don't really want to have that conversation, especially in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, it's a, well, we have no proof of that, or, you know, we really don't do that. But there is a lot of proof about some pretty bad impacts on developing countries. To answer your question, what impact does corporate tax avoidance have on countries and people in the global south? The truth is we don't exactly know. This is because at a very basic level, there's no public data available on a country by country basis to ascertain what are the impacts on developing countries and rich countries. And this is obviously a huge problem in terms of basic economics. If you don't have basic data, you can't come to robust conclusions. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there's evidence out there. Work by journalists in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, leaks like the Panama Papers, forensic financial assessments by academics like Gabriel Zuckman, as you mentioned, and numerous reports from civil society actors like Oxfam and Tax Justice Network have given us a fairly good picture of the levels and types and impacts of corporate tax avoidance in poor countries. It's not a super pixelated picture, but it's clear enough for us to have some pretty good conclusions. So the biggest impact and most obvious impact on low-income countries of tax avoidance is revenue loss. Research by a number of reputable agencies have given us a good estimation of the losses involved. 2015, the UN estimated that developing countries lose about 100 billion annually as a result of corporate tax avoidance. This is more than enough to provide education for about 124 million children that were out of school before the onset of COVID-19, and to pay for health interventions that could save millions of lives, or around 6 million lives. The IMF has also done an estimation, and they estimated that double that amount, about 200 billion, is lost in revenue to developing countries. And other estimations are slightly higher, but we're talking between 1 and 200 billion of lost revenue every year. So to put these figures in perspective, the total global aid budget of OECD countries last year was 153 billion. These figures should also be taken in the context of the COVID pandemic, that we estimate could push about 500,000 people back into poverty, or 8% of the world's population. According to the World Health Organization, at least half of the world's population don't have access to essential healthcare, and this is in the context of COVID-19. Imperial College has estimated that you need about 159 billion to double public health spending in the world's 85 poorest countries. And that's a nice figure between the IMF and the UN's figures. So this has a real impact on people's lives, especially now within the pandemic that we're all facing. Another factor to take into account is because of the structure of their economies, corporate tax avoidance has a relatively disproportionate impact on poor countries. Obviously, it's not just poor countries that it impacts everyone or every country. But in poor countries, corporate tax revenues as a proportion of total tax revenues are twice as important as they are for rich countries, accounting for about 16% of tax receipts compared with 8% for high income countries. The IMF has showed that developing countries are up to 3 times more vulnerable to negative effects of other countries' tax rules and shell companies than rich countries. There's a number of reasons for that. I won't go into it at the moment, but 3 times more impacted is pretty high. The United Nations University have also recently suggested that the poorer the country it is, the more likely it is that a corporation will shift their profits out of that country. So corporate tax avoidance is a big deal for poor countries, and it impacts their poorest citizens most. When governments reduce their tax burden for large corporations or have less revenue coming in than they should have, they tend towards 2 options. They cut back on essential spending to reduce inequality and poverty, or they make up the shortfall by levying higher taxes such as VAT or other on other less wealthy sections of society. Indirect taxes such as VAT, which fall disproportionately on poor people, make up an average of 67% of tax revenues in sub-Saharan Africa, impacting women most. At the same time, increased profits as a result of lower corporation tax benefit shareholders and owners of corporations who are predominantly wealthy white men, further increasing economic, gender and racial inequality. So this is at where the rubber hits the road, really, corporate tax avoidance. Money has been taken away from public services that will benefit the most vulnerable and poorest, and it's being derived by the richest people and most powerful people in our societies. Increasing attention has also been drawn to how tax avoidance negatively affects women's rights. 2018, a UN Women's Report concluded that transnational tax avoidance and planning and tax havens have negative effects on gender equality, while the European Parliament has also recognized that harmful effects of tax avoidance on women in a recent report on gender inequality and taxation policies in the EU. Women are more likely to be poor than men and depend most on public services that are invariably cut back. And in 2015, a UN review concluded that governments worldwide were allocating insufficient resources for targeting investments in gender equality and also for sectors such as health, education and social protection. So the next time you hear a CEO of a multinational company or a senior politician saying, of course we support gender equality, ask them about tax avoidance. What is their policies on tax avoidance? It's also important to look at tax havens in poorer countries and how this has impacted people there. So Mauritius, for example, is often cited as an African success story, which over the past decade has seen substantial economic growth. However, much of this growth is attributable to the fact that Mauritius operates as one of the world's worst tax havens, depriving many other African countries of millions of dollars in tax revenues. However, according to a recent World Bank report, inequality among Mauritians has widened substantially over the last 15 years, threatening the standards of living of the poor. Again, women in particular have not shared gains, with only 50% of them participating in the labour force, while women in the private sector are paid on average about 30% less than men. So if we're serious about women's rights and gender equality, we need to get serious about tax dodging. However, I think it's important also to look at not just corporate tax avoidance, but to look at the structural issue of corporate tax competition among countries at a regional and global level. Oliver has mentioned coordinated approaches at various different regional and international bodies, especially the OECD, and they are slowly making it more difficult for individual countries to continue to facilitate corporate tax avoidance. But in response to this, countries are more likely to compete for foreign investment by offering ever more generous tax incentives and reductions in their corporate tax rates. In 1990, the average statutory corporate tax rate for OECD countries was about 40%. By 2017, it nearly halved to be 24.7%, and it's still falling. While a recent study by the Financial Times shows the multinationals' effective tax rates have fallen from 35% in the 90s to 20% in 2016. This competition is creating a race to the bottom whereby a small number of countries may temporarily gain in the short term, while in the long term, all countries risk losing as extreme competitive pressures negatively impact their sovereign right to raise a fair level of taxation. So even if we're successful at reducing or even eliminating the impact of shell companies and corporate tax avoidance, there's a danger that this race to the bottom will lead to a situation where corporations start reporting the correct amount of profits in each country, but still pay very little taxes on these profits. This has serious implications for poor countries' ability to mobilize sufficient domestic revenue to fund universal public services that tackle inequality and beat poverty, and to fund the social and physical infrastructure that fosters prosperity. The reasons why companies locate in a jurisdiction are much broader than just corporate tax policy, despite what you will hear from politicians and corporate interests. Just one of the 12 indicators of the World Economic Forum relates to competitiveness, or relates to corporate tax avoidance. Ireland had had a low corporate tax rate since the 50s, but foreign investment only really started increasing in the 1990s after the Maastricht Single European Act came in. Other countries in the European Union have lower tax rates than Ireland, but have nowhere near the same level of investment. So it's a lot more than just your corporate tax rate. And this is born in a World Bank survey of investors in East Africa, where 93% said they would have invested anyway, even if the tax incentives had been on offer. Tax incentives cost Kenya 1.1 billion a year, almost twice as much as the government spends on its health budget. And Nigeria spends 2.9 billion on tax incentives, twice as much as it does on education. So I think the discussion has to be broader than just shell companies and just avoidance. It's the interrelationship between reducing tax take, even outside the avoidance aspect, which is an issue. So I'm just going to finish up with talking about one of the potential solutions to these issues. I think it's important, and I think everybody would realize you need to have regional or global solutions. Expecting one country to stick their head above the parapet and change their tax laws isn't really realistic. But one that would make a big difference, I think, is a global minimum effective tax rate. And this is being discussed at the OECD currently as Pillar 2. Obviously, this won't end competition for investment among countries, but by limiting the scope of corporate tax-based competition, it will mean that competition for investment in the future will be more likely to be based on the quality of social institutions and physical infrastructure within the countries. With revenues already dwindling severely in the wake of COVID, governments can simply not afford to keep bleeding. So fostering competitions in the other areas away from tax would hopefully create a race to the top that not only fosters prosperity, but also addresses inequality and tackles poverty.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. I love your phrasing of the race to the top with investment versus de-investment and a race to the bottom. And you touched on a lot of different issues there, the intersectionality of race and power, as well as female empowerment and how that impacts that. So it was a really great overview. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, Kadia Sharif of the Organised Crime Corruption Reporting Project. This organization exposes crime and corruption so that the public can hold power to account. So she's going to talk to us about the impact of shell companies and tax avoidance on the economies within Africa. So welcome, Kadia.
Thank you. I apologize that my camera is not working. It's a connectivity problem, but I hope that I come across clearly. So my country, South Africa, is one of the most unequal in the world. About 90% of the wealth belongs to a handful of people, and everyone else has to share the rest. And inequality, of course, is often a consequence of corruption, but in some countries like South Africa, and many countries, in fact, the laws are designed to sustain loopholes, to sustain the status quo that enables systemic inequality as the legitimate model. So if you think about it in terms of 100 water bottle, 90 water bottles would go to just a few people, 5 water bottles would go to the brokers that keep the system running, and everybody else would get a sip. So that's kind of the precarious and desperate state that most people in the country live in and on, maybe about 100 US per month if they're lucky. And yet the country loses over 25% of its GDP to illicit flows in technically legal ways. It's FDI stock flowing to tax havens like Luxembourg and the Netherlands, mostly through corporate tax avoidance, but also through other means. It's the double taxation agreements with tax havens like Mauritius that was just previously discussed by the Oxfam representative. But to dive into specific examples, you know, the World Bank did this report called the Wealth of Nations, and it showed that when African countries extract their minerals, they often end up with a net deficit. So they often end up poorer than had they not extracted the minerals in the first place. And we looked into one of the more respectable companies and industries, the diamond industry. South Africa was one of the world's biggest diamond producers. And long after apartheid ended, from 2004 until 2012, the country lost over 30 billion rand, or $3.5 billion, through the undervaluation of diamond exports. So if a diamond was worth $800 coming out of the ground, the diamond companies could fix the value of $100 or $150 and eliminate through a paper transaction the bulk of the diamond's actual value. And one company was responsible for this, De Beers, which was then owned by Anglo American. They own 95% of the industry, a very anti-competitive monopoly, and they siphoned about $2.8 billion in value from the diamond. But it gets even worse because by 2010, South Africa was the only country on the continent to have no royalties around minerals. And when it was implemented after a massive protest from the so-called foreign investors, it was done at a sliding scale. So it was done against revenue, which of course was very little because these companies used shell entities in secrecy jurisdictions to create artificial losses. So in 2011, for example, when we exported $1.7 billion worth of diamonds, the sliding scale revenue only got us $11 million. So for decades after apartheid ended, the country continued to get ripped off in technically legal ways, using laws that were skewed against the public interest, that were put in place by those who write the rules, and using shell companies to create artificial costs to decrease the amount that would go to the public purse. But you know, more recently, of course, corruption is also a big cause. With state capture, the debt that has been accrued through the losses is about 5 trillion rand. So even if we report, for example, OCCRP did a story on the 595 million that had been stolen from Eskom through a series of shell companies. The South African banks claim that they no longer banked the Zuma faction, the Guptas who were responsible, but through shell companies, the banks continue to allow illegal money from illegal clients to flow through. They simply said, you know, although the legal form is being documented, we don't know who the beneficial owners are. So that is the trick of shell company. They perform almost like a kind of a suitcase where, you know, on the one hand, there is no owner. The suitcase moves through the airport. It's hypermobile and it can translate or transport something. Maybe it's a bribe, an increase in artificial cost. It could hold shares for a politician or hide money or launder money. It could conduct mirror trades, as in the case of the swaps. Or it could be something that has a hidden false bottom, where it is part of a corporate company, but it conceals another ulterior motive that skews ultimately what the situation looks like and conceals information. And I think that's particularly the case now with COVID, because if we think about something that appears as bland and sanitized as the pharmaceutical industry, South Africa, of course, had a long history with trying to get ARVs to people who are infected with HIV and AIDS. And they paid such exorbitant amount for the pharmaceuticals that the US companies claimed they had to recoup the costs for developing. But within this development of innovative drugs are 2 layers of transaction. The first is the known and disclosed data, the loans, the expenses, the income. But the second is the financial dealings involving internally developed intangible assets. So whenever a pharmaceutical company is listed on a stock exchange, you see that 85% of that value comes from internally imputed value, what the pharmaceutical company says the value of the company is worth, like patents. But when you strip it away, you see that many of these companies, including Pfizer, have a deficit in terms of book value. So a while ago, we did a story on how much 11 pharmaceutical companies were avoiding in taxes and eroding from the public purses of countries globally. And we found in a single year, it was $140 billion from over 400 billion in revenue. Pfizer led the pack at 25.9 billion in avoided tax. Merck followed 21 billion, Johnson & Johnson 18.6 billion. And the problem is that although these companies are making the money from avoiding taxes as unredistributed profit held in shell companies, mostly in the Netherlands and Ireland, but also Puerto Rico and so forth, 80% of new drug costs, the innovation to develop new drugs, as with COVID vaccine, is borne by the public. So the National Institute of Health will pay the cost for developing the drugs. The public will ultimately pay that cost, but the pharmaceutical companies will make a lot of money by commercializing it. And ultimately, the public will have to pay another cost, which is the very high price of buying these drugs, which the pharmaceutical companies claim they alone developed. So they never factor in the cost to the public in terms of how they make their money, not just pharmaceuticals, but also mining companies. The fiscal social contract between corporate companies and the state is usually one-sided because the state, many developing countries, and this includes the tax havens who are forced, small countries, islands that are geographically isolated, are forced to commercialize their sovereignty for a little bit of money, because ultimately they are dependent on the US and the UK who control these tax havens, either as offshore territories or within their jurisdictions, such as Delaware. So we find that a lot of the blame, now that it's known, the role of financial secrecy is known, people put the blame on the British Virgin Islands, but these very small islands are politically and geographically isolated and dependent on the bigger powers that write the rules, that make the rules, that ultimately allow for these trillions of dollars to be stashed offshore. And of course, it's often the people who promote capitalism who say, we need these kinds of perks and incentives because this is called tax optimization. But forgetting that criminals and corrupt politicians camouflage their own gains in these same loopholes that are kept open by corporate companies, the sad reality is that the argument works against capitalism because it's fundamentally anti-competitive. It destroys the businesses that actually are paying their taxes, that are trying to work honestly. And it allows for a hand-in-glove corruption between the corporate company that pays off the corrupt politician, the criminal that exploits the same loopholes, and the public that ultimately bears the price. So whether we're talking about mining, or we're talking about pharmaceutical companies, or the industry, they all ultimately prey on the public by using loopholes that are deliberately sustained. And even though metrics, like the World Bank's metric of relative inequality appears to show that poor people are making gains, in absolute terms, the world is getting worse, more precarious, and more dangerous. And the metrics that we have been told to rely on, like gross domestic products, these don't work because ecologically, the world cannot keep producing for consumers to keep a so-called growth model up to check.
Hello, Kaja. I think we've lost your input there. Let me know if you can come back online in the next minute, and if not, we'll move on. Yeah, so I think unfortunately we lost Kaja, but she was giving us a really interesting insight into how these issues affect not only the poorest of the poor, but also climate change, the eternal growth model that's being pursued. And I think a lot of people within the capitalist system who are pro-capitalist, who are maybe small businesses, cafe owners, restaurants, who are all decimated by the COVID lockdown, who all pay their taxes, will be sickened to hear that the biggest players within that system aren't paying their fair share. So I think that's really interesting. With that picture in mind, it's a little bleak. Maybe we can go now to Transparency International, to Max Haywood, who is the head of policy at Transparency International at their secretariat. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about what are these solutions. We've already heard from some of the speakers about some ideas for solutions, but maybe Max, you can go broader into this.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Roberta, and the whole Rethinking Economics team. It's great to be with you. I've been following your work as a former economist before working for an NGO for a couple of years now. So it's really, really essential what you guys are doing to push the agenda forwards. It was already sort of 20 years ago now, but I did not have anything like this in my sort of studies. So I remember the firm being about, profit maximization, transaction costs, that kind of thing. At no point did anyone mention the fact that 10% of global GDP is offshore, anything like that. So it's great to see that this is being moved forward like this. And in fact, that estimate by Suchman was 2 weeks ago proven to be actually on the low side. So the OECD released new data that shows that his estimate is about 8 trillion is offshore. The official OECD data, the most recent, show they have found 10 trillion, and that is only based on their own data. So this number just keeps growing the more data becomes available. And so I think the Kadir and Michael and Oliver have spoken about the impact of this and why this matters. So I won't go into that too much, but just to say that it's an essential part of our work as an anti-corruption NGO. So we have partners in more than 100 countries around the world. We're set up as a network. So I'm based in Berlin, which is, we support the network from Berlin, but, we're based in more than 100 countries. And, this issue of anonymous shell companies keeps coming up, if it's, not just in terms of, bribery, but also foreign bribery. So the activities of multinationals in developing countries, you keep finding shell companies in those cases. Cases of grand corruption, you also keep finding shell companies appearing in those cases. So they really do keep coming up again and again, just showing that, these are essential, some people call them getaway cars for corruption and crime. So there's such an effective way of hiding your tracks and hiding the proceeds of your corruption or tax avoidance or tax evasion or fraud. It's sort of one system, and inside that black box, you can do almost anything you want if you can hide behind this secrecy. But my job is to actually talk about solutions. And so I think, the perhaps irony here is that the technicalities of the solutions are reasonably clear. This is more a political issue. So we'll be talking for a few minutes about both of those, about the technicalities and about the politics of why there hasn't been more progress yet, right? Although there has been some, as I think Oliver was saying at the beginning. And I think it's important to remember that, at its core, as again, I think Oliver was saying, a firm is a legal fiction in a way. It's an abstract legal concept. It's not about the people or the building or the brand or the services. At its essence, this is a legal construct. And what's perhaps the core question here is, you can of course make the argument for limited liability, to support entrepreneurs and to support investment. But what is the real social benefit of anonymity? We still haven't heard anyone to make a solid case for why, owning a company, making anonymity, being able to hide behind a company actually adds anything truly to the, the social benefits beyond the profit of the individuals involved. So that's a sort of almost a philosophical question, but is at the core of this, of the challenge that we're facing, right? And this also links, I think, to the technical solutions, which are very easy to say, but kind of hard to implement. Essentially, the way to address this challenge of anonymous companies is essentially to be able to identify the real person, the real, what they call the beneficial owners technically, who is actually controlling the company. And this is not necessarily about the percentage they own, so you may see, if you look this up, you'll find discussion around what percentage do they own? Is it 25%? Is it 20%? At its core, it's about who is controlling, who is the real human being. A legal fiction cannot make decisions. There's always human beings making decisions. Who is that human being making the decisions behind the company? So that would be sort of the starting point, the outcome we want. It should be possible to identify who is making the decisions for any company in the world. And the next question, I guess, is when we say we, who are we talking about? And the argument that we are making is from an NGO perspective is that it should be anyone. It should be a member of the public, a journalist, a law enforcement agent. It shouldn't matter. The who should not matter. It should be anyone who could be able to identify who it is that they are doing business with, or who is, for example, buying the house next door. There's a whole variety of activities that it should be possible to know who is behind those decisions. And I'm mentioning this because the official global standard to tackle this problem at the moment only refers to law enforcement. So the official, this is the technical solution, if you will, it says that, which is set by a body called the Financial Action Task Force, which is based in Paris and has, members in 180 countries around the world. So that means 180 countries, practically all the countries in the world, have signed up to this. They have agreed to do this. It's not something that, the solution to this problem is a mystery that no one has yet figured out. The solution technically is well known. It just hasn't been yet implemented correctly. Basically says that the countries should make sure that law enforcement and supervisory bodies and the authorities in countries should be able to identify who is behind a company that's trying to do business, for example, to open up a bank account. Now, we have basically two arguments there. The first is that no country is actually doing that effectively to the extent of many countries have taken very promising steps, but none of them is doing that to the full extent that they should to actually make the system work. So in other words, to make it easy to check who you're doing business with and verify their identity is correct. No one has yet hit that sort of gold standard. But secondly, that the standard itself should shift. So it should be possible for members of the public to also go online. For example, there was a mention of the UK public register. Ideally, every country in the world should have one of those. That is the ultimate goal, because otherwise, as Michael was saying, countries just undercut themselves. And if you have one or two countries that are not doing this, then there's a risk that dark money, dirty money will flow towards those countries. If you leave loopholes in the system, it will not allow for a comprehensive solution. That's why it has to be this global solution that applies to basically every country in the world. And we're not really that far off. I mean, when I started working for TI, and as recently as, just before the Panama Papers, if you had told, I think anyone working in this field, that there would be, a public beneficial ownership list, register, sort of a database where you can look this up in any country, they would have said you're dreaming, so there has been progress made. There's up to 80 countries now have made some sort of commitment to take this step, 80 out of 180 countries. The challenge is that, that leaves 100 countries to go. But the biggest challenge is that they haven't really implemented that commitment effectively, right? And so basically the technical solution, just to recap, would be that every country should have a public database. You can just go online, and if you're dealing with, for example, let's say that someone wants to buy your house and they claim to be representing, Cup Incorporated or Pen Incorporated, you can go and look up Pen Incorporated and you can find out who is behind it. And then you can do a bit of background checks to see if that is someone you really want to be doing business with. Now, to get to that point, you need quite a lot of data, etc. And there are questions around how much it will cost, and we can get into that perhaps in the Q&A. But the main point is that the technical solution is there. So the challenge, I think, is about why there hasn't been more progress. So as we were saying, 180 countries have signed up to this since 1989, so for decades now. The G20 governments committed to take action against this issue and to increase the safeguards to prevent the abuse of these shell companies in 2014. The EU countries, the EU standard against money laundering has also, put in place some measures. And some of the challenges why this has not actually been implemented. So these standards so far, to a certain extent only exist on paper, and countries are not yet translating them into laws, and they're not actually creating these databases, have to do with essentially political priorities. So decision makers are always competing. They have a list of, 20, 30, 50 different, competing priorities. And to make a decision like this, it really has to get to the top of their list. So a lot of the work that NGOs do is to just try and get our issues to the top of the list of the relevant minister or decision maker or parliament, to try and get them to actually make to do the right thing, to do what they already know they have to do. So for example, this progress in the US, colleagues and partners, and there's been a whole coalition of NGOs working towards this for years now, trying to get this legislation through the US. It's not that the solution wasn't known, it's just that the legislation was not getting passed, mainly because of vested interests who are always pushing back. So you always have sort of vested interests who are benefiting from the system. Maybe some of them not even illegally. So the tax avoidance industry, for example, is by definition broadly legal. We can talk about the gray zone between avoidance and evasion. But you have sort of very powerful vested interests pushing back, and perhaps not enough people supporting the actual change that has to happen. So you have to sort of get to a point, that tipping point, where you switch the balance and the politics change, and you can get things to the next phase, right? And two of the main arguments that you hear from people who are against these measures, who are against more transparency, who are against people being able to find out who they're doing business with easily, have to do with privacy and with cost. And the privacy argument is very interesting. So the arguments that you find, if you just Google, for example, beneficial ownership, privacy, or, or risks, you find arguments around the risks of, for example, kidnapping. So an argument you hear, and I've been on panels with people who've actually made this argument, where, won't this increase the risk of kidnapping? If people can go online and see who owns a company, won't that increase the risk of, for example, they being victims of fraud or victims of kidnapping? The trouble with that is that there is so far no evidence to support it. So we have countries like the UK who have had beneficial ownership registers for a while. To my knowledge, there has not been a wave of kidnapping since that happened in those countries. So it's a hypothesis which is worth exploring, and which, of course, privacy has to be taken seriously. But there is no concrete evidence that making the ownership of companies, which, by the way, is not one of the main. It's unlikely that, for example, a would-be criminal would go on a government database to research their next target. They're more likely to go on Instagram or the Forbes wealthiest list. So there are many other sources that someone who wants to target someone wealthy would be looking at, rather than going on a government database to see who owns a certain company. But beyond that, and the lack of evidence, the privacy aspect is something to be taken seriously, and it can be dealt with. For example, several registers have what they call a privacy exemption. So, for example, if I want to register a company and I have a genuine concern, for example, that my name being known for some reason could be, for example, if I'm operating in a really high risk environment, for example, I want to invest in a very high risk environment where there is a true threat to my well-being or that of my staff, for example, there are privacy exemptions. So for example, you can tick a box and you can request an exemption. And that's okay, as long as the authorities look into it and your request holds up. And that should be there, that privacy exemption should be there, but it should be the exception, not the rule. The rule should be, it should be possible to identify who you are doing business with at all times through a simple online search, basically. And the other argument that is often made is about the cost, so the cost of setting up this database, so how are you going to register millions of companies, and there are so many, this will be so expensive to operate, especially for developing countries, for example. And again, that is something to be taken seriously. The challenge, though, is that most countries, including developing countries, already have some type of company register. They're not starting from scratch. They have the tax authorities often have different databases that they're using. The banking authority has different databases they're using. There are commercial registers, and these can be adapted, repurposed. Yes, it will cost some money to adapt them and to put the information online, but in no context is this cost so high that can be used as a justification to not take this step, to not make this data public. And there are a range of NGOs, and including development agencies, for example, who would be happy to help countries who want to take this step. So again, we come back to the issue of the political decision-making and the political pressure on countries to actually take the steps that they know they should be taking, right? So yeah, I think that would be just the main points on terms of solutions and what can be done. And maybe just to say that, sessions like this one also important in terms of like that political pressure and having more people who are supporting these changes that have to happen. They really do matter. Every step matters in this sort of long slog to get towards that vision of having 193 countries around the world having these public registers that allow people to find out who they're doing business with. We're not there yet, but taking the long-term view into the next 10 years, we think we'll get there. We will definitely get there, but all of the support that we can get really does help. So thank you so much again.
That's great. Thank you so much, Max, for that really comprehensive overview. And I think what's important as well to highlight is that each country comes to this problem from a different position. For example, I'm based in Ireland, who can also be kind of referred to globally as a facilitator of some kind of tax shenanigans, we'll call them. I won't specify. I'm not qualified to specify further than that, but a lot of you will have been watching the Apple tax judgment recently, and things like that. And each country, one of the speakers mentioned that a lot of the countries that are kind of utilizing their sovereignty as their asset to invest in their own economies and make money. And just to kind of highlight that we need a globalized system, and we need to take into consideration the politics in each of those countries, and how do we work with the politics in each of those countries to drive the agenda forward, which is which somebody touched on as well. So that's the panelists for now. So I think we've got some questions coming in on the Q&A function. Just a shout out to the audience, to the attendees. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. And also take a look at the questions there and upvote what you think looks most interesting to have answered. So I think Ollie is looking through the questions and picking out the ones that have been most popular. So I'll pass over to him now to read out some of those questions. Ollie, are you there?
Okay, amazing. And thank you all to all the panelists. That was incredibly informative. So we've got a question from Gabriel Cabrera, which is the most upvoted one. And it's once again going back to underdeveloped countries. And it's asking how best can they fight tax evasion and avoidance, particularly given the challenges of perhaps a state that doesn't have the political initiative to charge big companies. And also if they don't yet have kind of the proper technological infrastructure. So that's the first question. And I believe Kadia is back with us. So I think we'll start with her because she got cut off. And then if anyone else wants to jump in after that, that'd be amazing. So Kadia, can you come off mute?
Yes, but actually if people have questions, I can just be silent, which I should generally be silent according to my old school principle. I was expelled, haha.
Okay, so if anyone else wants to jump in on that question, that's so specifically about underdeveloped countries.
Well, I can give it a try, but I am, despite your expulsion, Kadia, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. The most obvious way is that developing countries work in unison and together, and they're already doing this. The G77 of poor countries has been working and acting as a unified forum in the various negotiations in relation to tax avoidance. The challenge is that most rich countries are ignoring them. So that's the one obvious one, is to keep with it. In terms of the technical challenges and the lack of resources, that is obviously a big challenge. I think, as well as trying to support developing countries to up their own capacity, it's not really that helpful if the rules aren't changed, because as has been mentioned before, all these things are perfectly legal. So there's also about profit shifting. At the moment, what happens is countries assess, in terms of the accounts that companies present, whether they have been victims of profit shifting. And this can be difficult because of lack of revenue in a poorer country to take really big technical assessments. What would be equally helpful, and what we've called for, is that countries do two-way assessments. So they make assessments not only if they are being victims, but if the country is using, or if the company is using their jurisdiction to profit shift. So that would be beneficial to poorer countries, because it would be an onus on the country that is benefiting to name that and to assess it. But as you can imagine, not many rich countries have agreed to sign up to that.
That's great, thanks. Do any of our other panelists want to come in on that question?
Yeah, just to complement what Michael was saying, that the global cross-border nature of this is really important. You know, so if we're asking sort of a single country, even a developed country, to fix this problem by themselves, it's not going to work because of the global nature of this phenomenon of shell companies. So there has to be that coordination between nations. And especially, you know, for developing countries, that sort of working together to address the problem is essential. I mean, that being said, you know, the cost, as we were saying, of some of these measures, again, has to do with that political pressure or political will. So, for example, if you compare some of the technological infrastructure, for example, to the cost of hosting a major sporting event, you know, it's tiny, you know. So it again comes back to that sort of political pressure on decision makers to take the measures that are already available if they sort of are really seriously interested in taking the steps that need to be taken, right?
That's great. Yeah. And I think the important thing that you're saying there is that this is big money involved, and these actions are going to pay for themselves ultimately, if we get that kind of cohesion internationally. So Ollie, do we have any more questions coming through?
Yeah, so we have one question about from Florian Mante, who asks about blockchain money. So I guess for those who are less informed, maybe a slight definition of that, if anyone has a good idea, and how blockchain could be used and involved in reducing tax evasion and money laundering.
If I could pipe in on that, we're actually doing an investigation on wildlife trafficking, and we found that we had to go undercover to buy ivory and pangolin scales, and a lot of the traffickers like to use cryptocurrency. They send us their Bitcoin wallets. They teach you very patiently with video how to sign up to Coin Mama and buy your first tranche, and that your identity will never be exposed. And even when Ernst & Young is supposed to come in and conduct an audit of cryptocurrency fraud, they F up so wonderfully that it could be a cartoon series. So cryptocurrency is something that is critical for democratizing banking systems, but right now the only people, or the primary people that are using it, are those speculating on the value of money, those conducting mirror trades to launder money, and the people working in the illicit, the more gray areas and the dark money areas to move their money, because governments are still caught up in terms of, is it a currency, is it a property, how does it threaten the system? And of course, that system has never been, with fractional reserve banking, that system has never been fair. It's always been built upon debt. The very concept is built upon debt. If a bank gives you $1, they've got maybe 10% in reserve and they're loaning out 90%. So it creates the debt model that requires massive consumption to check the same debt, and which is set against the GDP model. But because cryptocurrency is being perceived as an enemy, it's not being regulated in a way that would allow for poorer people in the world to skip over the injustice of the normal financial banking system, which relies on credit records and so forth. And then you see with microfinance, the hidden costs and those debts that are not factored in as interest, but which pile up, are also discriminating against the world's poor people. So cryptocurrency needs to be understood and regulated in order for people to benefit from it. But right now it's being used in a way that undermines and deepens illicit and illegal activity.
Can I come in a bit on there as well? I agree, obviously, what Khadija is saying is absolutely spot on. But because I've been asked this question a few times, and I thought I'd try and understand a bit more about how cryptocurrencies work. And I've got a few mates who work now in financial technology companies that try and step in and regulate cryptocurrency in the absence of proper regulation from governments. And actually, it can be surprisingly easy for them to find out what bad guys are up to. There are quite a lot of naive crooks out there who don't realize that the problem with blockchain is that once you've done a transaction, it remains on the blockchain. So they will do, an illicit transaction and then be surprised that it's quite easy to find out that they've done it. So once you might not be able to find out who someone is, but you can get a very good picture of everything they've done, almost as if you've got access to someone's credit card details. So it's really an interesting double-edged sword for, looking into money laundering and looking into tax evasion and tax avoidance, in that although it's a good way of hiding your identity, it's not a very good way of hiding your transactions. So, I mean, it could be like all tools, it could be used for good or ill. And I actually think it could have a potential future role in trying to, crack down on some aspects of illicit finance in the same way that it sadly can have a role in expanding illicit finance. But yeah, at the moment, it certainly seems to be more kind of at the sort of more retail end of financial crime, in that the markets don't tend to be deep enough or liquid enough for really big kleptocrats or big companies want to get involved. I mean, they're mainly speculative, and so it's more for people trading pangolin scales or street level drugs rather than the massive cocaine cartels. Because if you're rich enough, then any currency is a cryptocurrency. That's the joy of shell companies.
Yeah, maybe just on that, from an enforcement perspective, what you see is that, fraudsters or tax evaders or criminals are, by definition, are playing the odds, so they're counting on the fact that, when you have trillions of dollars crossing borders, every day, the authorities will only be able to, monitor a tiny fraction of that. So in a way, you're sort of gambling on the fact that even if someone, can identify who you are in your transaction, that transaction will get lost in the flow, in that volume of, part of the ease which people can hide is just the amount of money sloshing around the financial system makes it so difficult to identify and separate the dirty money from the, so imagine if you are an employee of a law enforcement agency and it's your job, even if you have a computer and an algorithm or whatever, you then have to make a decision about what you investigate and what you don't. And in that sort of lack of resources, there's still where, criminals have a bit of an edge, because you always need that human element where even if it's technologically possible, you need to actually work on it, find out what's going on, need enough evidence to put up in court, get someone to freeze the account. There are so many steps to be taken that in that playing the odds, there's still unfortunately too much space for sort of criminals and tax criminals to sort of get away with it.
That's great, thanks. And I think what really came across there is that the political will is needed to kind of address, no matter what the mechanism is, if it's shell companies, if it's blockchain and cryptocurrency, that if the political will isn't there to regulate and enforce it and push that mechanism to be used in a good way, then there'll always be people who will exploit it and use it in the worst possible way, unfortunately. So we'll go, I think we've got more questions coming in. So Ollie, have you got the next one?
Yeah. So another question. So Daniel Figueroa is asking how the awareness in civil society, particularly in the most affected groups that we kind of mentioned, can best be increased about shell companies, tax avoidance and their impact. So I guess what can be done by me and the other people watching, or how can we get involved in like the efforts to kind of make this process better known and understood?
I was very impressed by some of the efforts that grew out of the last financial crisis, the last once in a century financial crisis before this one, and to highlight the role of tax avoidance in the profits of big companies like Starbucks and Vodafone and so on. UK Uncut here in the UK had an astonishingly imaginative range of protests that really managed to get this issue up the political agenda from essentially nothing to being, a major issue, just by some clever bits of occupying banking premises and so on, which was a lot of fun. I suppose the challenge is, in a time of social distancing and staying out of buildings, doing things like occupying bank premises is obviously not really cool. So, coming up with an alternative to that can be done in the open air with everyone 2 meters apart is a bit of a challenge, as any kind of protest is at the moment, I suppose. But it's, I suppose it's often the plus side of whenever there's an economic downturn is that the urgency of this issue tends to increase. So perhaps it will be a good time to try and get something going. And, and if you are, let me know, I'll be down the front.
If I may come in, perhaps the occupations and the street level activism is an important part of the process. But then when it gets on the political agenda, there's a more boring, long drawn out process of negotiation. And I think it's hugely important that it isn't just organizations who have a tax focus or a transparency focus. It's other organizations, either women's groups, people who work in social services that are involved in this conversation. And often I think they are reluctant or nervous about getting involved because it's seen as quite technical and economic heavy. So if people listening want to do something about this, I would say another option is maybe looking at what national networks would be affected by this, and offering to volunteer in terms of maybe helping them come up with a position on this. And I think by keeping it in the economic sphere, it's almost easier to manage and easier to detail. But if you talk about it as a gender equality issue or as a development issue, it's a lot harder to come up publicly anyway with opposition to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then,
Kadia, go ahead.
And then maybe, sorry about that. I was thinking that, the Financial Secrecy Index and the Tax Justice Network has for at least a decade, unpacked the systemic and integral role that these systems have caused, and they have proposed solutions. So we know inequality as a deliberate system, and then we know it as something that is being executed, and then the consequences of that execution. So if we begin to diagnose problems using the right words, for example, the financial secrecy index versus the corruption perception index, because we'll then see that financial secrecy as a trigger point that enables this to happen at a global level and between countries, between companies, within companies. That's something that places the secrecy jurisdictions as the most problematic aspects, allowing for this to happen, supply and demand, rather than just the corrupt countries like Nigeria that are using the system. So it's sort of like prosecuting the sex worker as opposed to the pimp, as opposed to the system that gave rise to it. In the same way, while economics should not define the problem, if we begin to use proper metrics, instead of, for example, relative inequality, we can use absolute inequality. We can factor inflation into the dollar per day metric, which will show a 5-cent increase on people's salaries in the past 4 decades. That is a devastating reality that shows that most people are falling into a more precarious situation than ever before. So just the language and the vocabulary that we use to fight, whether in articles or at a grassroots activism level or in the highest level of policies, that will dispel a lot of the myths and a lot of the fiction that's being used to sustain the problem. Because at the end of the day, some NGOs have a vested interest in using a language that doesn't really diagnose the problem, that keeps the problem going. And they are funded by that philanthropy from a system where the richest people in the world are the ones funding the NGOs. So there is a landscape that is problematic in and of itself, and that landscape and the vocabulary of that landscape also needs to be counted.
Yeah, and maybe just to add that the local dimension of the cost and the impact is getting increasingly easy to show. So just to give you an example, I live in Berlin, you know, and people are shocked at the rising house prices. That's something I think people in London have also, you know, experienced, and other major cities. And what's fascinating there is that people are increasingly making the link between shell companies and those rising house prices, because they literally at times cannot find who is buying the whole building next door. You know, so when you have sort of neighborhood associations who are outraged about gentrification, rising prices, who cannot find out who they're dealing with because the ownership is hidden behind layers and layers of complex shell companies, that really brings it home. And so you have movements in Berlin. There was a great tour earlier this year by a partner organization. They actually did you could walk with them with a guide, and this was just before COVID, and they would show you properties in Berlin that are owned through the Panama Papers. In other words, where the ownership is hidden, and we know the ownership is hidden. We only know the real owners thanks to the Panama Papers, if you know what I mean. So that really brings it home when you have a map and you can go and pinpoint different properties in a major city that are owned through shell companies, and that we only know this thanks to journalists. You know, so that really sort of brings the problem home, which also really helps to drive the political support, right?
That's great. Yeah, I think you've kind of covered the whole spectrum of the different ways people can kind of get involved in addressing this issue, from down to the very micro level, people who are working in social services and aid organizations and these things, to kind of think big and look at the global processes, the slow global processes advocating for these changes, and connect those to the real problems on the ground. For example, women's empowerment, poverty, connecting that up to the activism layer, protests, making noise, connecting those companies that rely on us as consumers to trust them and interact with them, and leveraging that relationship through protest and through information at that level, and then connecting it to economists. And we probably have a lot of economics students and economists on the line today, asking the right questions, looking at the real data, and not kind of being blindsided by these ideas of GDP and traditional measures of inequality, and looking at real inequality and what's been hidden. You're not going to see the real data if it's all hidden in these secrecy-based webs and networks. I think we've had a great set of questions. I'm conscious of the time running out, so I'd just love to go around to each of the panelists and get their final closing remarks and what you'd like to leave today's participants with. So we'll go in order of appearance. So maybe Oliver, if you wouldn't mind kicking that off.
Sure. Hello again. it's quite a meaty topic, and I think it can feel a bit hope draining when you listen to what needs doing and the depths of the hole we're in and the damage that this is doing to us all and to the coherence of society, both globally and within countries. It's pretty awful, I'm not going to lie. However, I work with an NGO in Ukraine called the Anti-Corruption Action Center, which has done astonishing work in a country with some really massive corruption problems. And I was talking to Daria, who helps run the ANTAC one day, and I asked her this. I was saying, how do you not give up? You're up against some seriously powerful people. I mean, her co-head, Vitaly, had his house burnt down last night. This is how bad things are. And she said, you're looking at this the wrong way. Our aim that we think about is not to make Ukraine 100% good. All we do every day is try and make it 1% better. That's it. So if you're constantly looking at this problem and saying, well, okay, we're up against all the biggest banks in the world, all the tax havens, all the biggest companies in the world, all the politicians, and all the kleptocrats simultaneously, you're like, well, I may as well just go and watch Netflix. But if instead you think, well, you know what, if we can just make things 1% better, then, that's good. That's already a win. So I think that's the way to look at it. And just the fact that we're all here talking about it and listening about it is a good thing. This is, 10 years ago, no one was interested in this topic. It's really good that people are now. I mean, I wasn't, for one. So well done for being here, and tell your friends and tell them that shell companies are evil, and that competitive inverted commas tax policies are harmful, and the more people know about it, the sooner we'll get something done.
That's great. I like that. I like 1% better as your daily metric. Michael?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Oliver's sentiments that maybe to put it in perspective, the global tax system that we have is really a century old, and nothing has happened for a century. And then in the last 10 years, both in public discourse and in processes to try and change it, a huge amount has happened, and hopefully a huge amount more will happen. So although from a day-to-day basis, it can seem quite slow, it's a bit like a glacier. We're slowly moving the glacier along, and I think the job is to steer it in a way that will be beneficial. And also just to remember that this is happening at multiple layers. Oxfam supports grassroots organizations throughout the world to look at budgets of governments and tax proposals. And the most dangerous thing, I think, in the world is having people at the grassroots who are economically literate, who can contradict what is being proposed by a government in a very simple way that ordinary people will understand. And that can bring about fundamental change. So yeah, no, things are happening, they're slow, but at least we're talking about it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Kaja?
Yes, it was amazing to be part of this and to be on a panel with such esteemed speakers and thinkers, Max and Oliver and the Oxfam rep. I was born at the tail end of apartheid, so for me it's very easy to imagine that the whole world can change within a few days, a few months, overnight, and that however bad things can look, the leaders of the African National Congress never imagined that apartheid would end in 1994. They thought it would go on for many, many more years. But because of the external pressure in countries like the United States and the internal pressure, everything built up to a momentum where one night the system just broke. So change and justice in our space and time can happen at any moment, and we should never give up hope, because that beautiful resistance is the thing that turns the tide, quickly or slowly, but it does happen.
Right, and I think that allusion to the glacier of change that is slowly happening, but it's really happening is a great idea. And Kaja, your comment on, I think there's a quote, if I can remember it, it'll be great. Sometimes there's years that nothing happens, and there's days that years happen within them. So change can come all of a sudden as well. Finally, we'll go to Max.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, I was just thinking, close to the place where I used to live in Berlin, there's a pretty small sort of punk bar that for many years was sort of the center in East Berlin of, just the cultural scene, and they kept going at it for years and years. And at some point in 1989, something clicked. And those big demonstrations that happened before the wall came down in 1989, now there's like museum tours, and you can go to this punk bar and they tell you this is where everything started, So this idea of like, people plugging away for years and years and years, and then suddenly something clicks, that keeps on happening, And we may be entering a point like that in this topic or this area. And just to think about, this call, if we were having this in person, I mean, probably not with Rethinking Economics, but probably the speakers would be on some sort of stage or some sort of little podium or something, and the people in the audience would be sort of at a different level. So there would be some sort of power imbalance. And definitely if it was a major conference at the OECD, there would definitely be this visual power imbalance. And what's fascinating now is that we're attending all of these webinars, and we've been on some recently with like ministers and big decision makers where we would be like in the audience looking at them. They're all just like squares on the screen. And so, just think about, what that tells us about people's tolerance for power inequalities, from now on. It's like it's really sort of squished things together. So people are a bit more aware that, at the end of the day, we're all just people at home with our bookcases and our kids coming in the screen, etc. So this tolerance in society for like massive inequalities and abuse of power is probably not going to stay the way it was until now. So, I think there's many reasons to be hopeful, but we have to keep pushing.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Max. Okay, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists. They've brought such an interesting topic to life for us, and it's such a complex topic as well. It's very difficult to sum up in a matter of 10-15 minutes. So it's been really, really fascinating. So thank you very much. And to our attendees, thank you very much for joining us and sticking with us till the end. We've had great attendance here today. What I'd say to the attendees is check out the other sessions happening. We're going till Sunday with this festival, and we've got an amazing program ready to go for you. So do check those out. We have a Facebook page if you want to continue on the chat. We've got a Facebook group. Oliver has put that in the chat. We're also running a survey on your approach to economics. The link to the chat, the link to that is in the chat as well that Oliver's put there. And we've put the links to the organizations and to Oliver's Twitter to check out his book and check out the work that those organizations do if you're interested, if you want to continue on this pathway. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you in the other sessions.
Thanks, everyone. That was amazing.